And it's my pleasure today to welcome Marina Ottaway, who is our speaker. Ms. Ottaway is a Middle East Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. She is an analyst of political transformations in Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East. Her latest project is a review of the Arab Spring. Marina Ottaway joined the Wilson Center after 14 years at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, during which she played a central role in launching the endowment's Middle East program. Prior to joining the Carnegie organization, Ottaway taught at Georgetown University, the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, the American University in Cairo, the University of Witwatersrand, however you pronounce that, in South Africa, the University of Zambia, and the Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. Wow, what a lovely CV and interesting parts of the world to be amongst. Marina Ottaway is the author of 9 books. In 2019, she and her husband, David Ottaway, published A Tale of 4 Worlds, the Arab region after the uprisings. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Egypt, the topic for today. According to the Brookings Institution, beginning with the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty negotiated at Camp David, the United States enjoyed a strong partnership with Egypt's leaders. That partnership was rooted in a shared strategic and security goal for the region, including Arab-Israeli peace, resisting Soviet influence in the region, and preventing any single regional state from dominating the others. President Abdel Fattah Al-Sisi, his Egypt, rather than driving Arab policies, again, this is the Brookings point of view, as did former President Hosni Mubarak, follows the leads of his backers, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Sisi seems to be bent on fighting a regional war for power and influence against his perceived adversaries, the Islamist political movements, Qatar and Turkey, and most of all, against anyone inside Egypt who dares to dissent from Sisi's views. On September 14th, recently, 2021, Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced that the Biden administration will withhold $130 million of military aid to Egypt until Cairo takes specific steps related to improving human rights. Nevertheless, the Biden administration has requested $1.43 billion in aid to Egypt for 2022. 94% of which is for peace and security. We are now poised to learn far more from our speaker, Marina Ottaway. Over to you, Marina. Thank you for being part of us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction. To the audience, I have to say that it's always difficult to talk to a new audience because you are never quite sure where the audience is in terms of their knowledge of the area. It's particularly difficult and challenging to talk to an audience that you cannot see. So bear with me if I stumble on certain things, because essentially I'm sending my words out in cyberspace and I don't quite know what's on the other side. The topic I have been asked to address is that of what US policy towards Egypt should be. And this is certainly a very hotly debated issue among experts in the area. And I wanted to preface the discussion of what the policy actually should be, first of all, with a glib answer, that the answer is not easy. Like all policy issues have so many different angles. There are so many different issues that need to be taken into consideration that it's very difficult to come up with a clear-cut answer. That is, yes, the United States should withhold foreign aid. No, the United States should not withhold foreign aid. So in order to try and understand the nuances of the problem, the difficulty of making a decision on this issue of what the policy towards Egypt should be, I would like to start with a promised brief discussion of the ideas that are always debated about what US foreign policy should be in general. As you probably know, there are two schools concerning foreign policy. Very briefly, a realist school that argues that policies should be based on national interest. In other words, from a realist point of view, the only questions that should guide US policy towards any country in any circumstances is where are US interests here and what is the best way of serving those US interests. There is another school which is called the idealist school, which argues that self-interest is not enough, that US foreign policy should be guided by values, by fundamental American values, and those have to be factored into any policy decision. This is the basic issues, this is the basic choice. I would like to point out something that many people forget to take into consideration, is that the choice between realism and idealism is not so easy, because there is no such, because even an idealistic policy has to be based in realism. In other words, if you say US policy should be based mostly on the promotion of human rights, on the defense of and the propagation of American values throughout the world, if you don't know that you can actually do it, if there is no realistic assessment of whether it's possible to do, you end up with a disaster. And I think we have a very clear example of a policy that had a strong element of idealism, that is US policy towards Afghanistan, where not only we overthrew the Taliban government that posed, we thought, a threat to United States security, but then tried to promote a democratic state. And the promotion of that democratic state was a disaster, not because it was wrong to try and do so, but because it was something that the United States could not even remotely accomplish. In other words, we tried to do something in the name of principle. We tried to do something that it was not even remotely in our possibility, in our capacity to do. So I think when we debate this choice between a policy towards Egypt based on idealism and a policy based on realism, we also have to ask a third question, and it is, what is possible? In other words, what can be achieved? Keeping in mind that the United States is not omnipotent, and that try to restructure, try to change another society is an enormously difficult activity that very, very rarely succeeds. I will not say, we'll come back to this point later, I will not say never succeeds, but my point is that changing another country very, very rarely succeeds. So this is the basic, the background issues concerning this. Now, let's come to Egypt. And so there are two questions that have to be answered here. If we want to pursue a realistic policy, what are the US interests in Egypt at this point? Why should we pay any attention to Egypt? From the point of view of a realist policy, is it worthwhile investing in Egypt, or should we walk away from Egypt? Then I'll ask the same question concerning an idealistic policy. What does an idealistic policy toward Egypt look like? And are we in a position to implement it? So let's start with the US interests in Egypt. And I would argue that US interests in Egypt are much more limited now than they have been in the past. Let me give you a brief historical overview of what these interests have been. Back in the 1950s, when the United States really starts engaging with Egypt, Egypt under the monarchy, it was there. It was a country that was mostly, it was in the British zone of influence. We did not pay a lot of attention to it. But really, with the rise of, a coup d'etat carried out by the free officers in 1952, of whom Gamal Abdel Nasser was the best known, right? So you can call it the Nasser coup d'etat in Egypt in 1952. Beginning with that time, Egypt started attracting a lot of attention by American foreign policy makers. Why is that? There are two main reasons. One was that Nasser had an enormous influence in the Arab world. Whatever we think of him now, I think it's important to remember that Gamal Abdel Nasser, in many ways, was a symbol of the Middle East in the 1950s and 60s. Why is that the case? First of all, he led a coup d'etat by young officers, by young military officers, against a monarchical regime that was corrupt, that was, in many ways, that was dying, that was incapable of governing Egypt, and re-energize the country. Now, coup d'etats are not good things. I'm not defending a coup d'etat. Let's keep in mind that this was not a coup d'etat against a democratically elected regime. This was a coup d'etat against a corrupt monarchy. So there is something to be said for that. But what the coup d'etat did really liberated or gave rise to a very dynamic Egypt that was seen as a model in the rest of, by many people in the Arab world. Gamal Abdel Nasser influenced an entire generation of young Arabs. And it's, you know, even today you talk to a lot of well-educated Arabs and so on, and they all went of a certain age, and they went through this Nasserist phase, because Nasser was in many ways the savior. He was a man who was leading an important Arab country out of the doldrums and towards a better future. Now, what was this better future that he envisaged? And we look at it in retrospect and we said, well, it was not such a great future, because Nasser embraced ideas that were very popular in the third world at that time, of how the state had to draw development, hence state enterprises, hence state investment, hence state control of the economy. And that and it really had to limit the role of private enterprise. Nasser implemented the land reform, but more than anything else, what really stays, and to this day has not been eliminated, is this tradition of state control over the economy, and also state control over political issues, because Nasser was certainly no Democrat. I mean, he, like many people, most leaders, historically, who have a very strong image of what they want to accomplish, he was an autocrat. If you have a purpose, if you have a vision of what you are trying to do, you become an autocrat, because the vision is more important than the individuals who try, the individual choices that keep you from attaining that view. So Nasser was an autocrat. It was you know, the country was tightly controlled. You could not make a phone call without assuming that that phone was being tapped. Given the states of technology in Egypt at that time, you often knew that it was being tapped, because you could hear the whirring of the machine that was taping your message on the other side. It was not particularly subtle, but this is what was happening. So, but because of this vision he had for an Egypt and an Arab world, because he promoted a vision of Pan-Arabism, that is of Arab unity, Nasser really inspired a generation. So the relations with Egypt in the 50s was very important because it meant sending a message about US relations with the rest of the Arab world. It was not just Egypt, it was beyond that. Second, in this period, Egypt really was the most important country in the Arab world. Not only because it was the biggest country in the Arab world, although Egypt had a small population compared to in the days of Nasser, it had a population of about 26 million, and now it has over 100 million. But other Arab countries also were much smaller then, so that Egypt was this towering country among countries with relatively small population, particularly in the Gulf and so on, the tiny, tiny countries. So Egypt was very influential. It was not only a political center, it was a cultural center. Egyptian music dominated. Egyptian film dominated. Essentially, it was really a cultural beacon for the region. What is the situation today? And the situation today is, and relating this to the US interest, that Egypt is no longer a beacon. It still thinks that it's a beacon. It still thinks of itself as the most important country in the Arab world. But in reality, it's not. Other countries don't look up to Egypt any longer, the way they did in Nasser's time. They have been, in all, economically, they're not a powerhouse any longer. The Egyptian economy is limping along. It has been doing very badly in certain periods. It's doing somewhat better now, but it still has a problem freeing itself from state control that over the years has become not just controlled by the state, but controlled by the military. The Egyptian economy is today very heavily dominated by the military. That backs Abdel Fattah Sisi, the president, and de facto controls the country. I would argue that Egypt today is controlled by the military established, or by the security established more broadly, much more that is controlled by the president. I think the president serves on the tolerance of the security establishment. So Egypt is no longer that beacon. Certainly it's not economically. The Gulf countries are infinitely richer than Egypt now and much more dynamic. I mean, the Arab countries, sure, the wealth of the Gulf countries comes from oil production, we all know that, but it's going well beyond, for some of the most important countries, it's going well beyond oil production. Particularly the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, to a lesser extent Saudi Arabia, are also centers of technological development, are very dynamic economic centers. Culturally, the country is no longer the beacon that it used to be. Take, for example, the Egyptian film industry has declined. Egyptian films no longer dominated the Arab films. Very importantly, something that had a huge impact on the region were the television films that Egypt used to produce to be shown during the month of Ramadan. Ramadan is the month of fasting in Egypt, and the month of in the Muslim world. And during this month of fasting, evenings are very long because essentially people start living in after sundown when they break the fast, and then they go on all night with the families, with food, entertainment, and so on. And a very popular pastime in this period is watching these television serials. And it used to be that the Egyptian television serials, essentially they are soap operas, were dominating the entire Muslim world, or at least the Arab-speaking world. And now the place of Egypt has been taken by Turkey. it's now Turkish soap operas that dominate. I'm not saying that the Turkish soap operas are necessarily better than the Egyptian ones. I don't watch either in any case, but they have become more popular, probably because they represent a more modern view of the world. For whatever reason, I will not go into that. So essentially, Egypt is no longer that center of the Arab world, economically and culturally, and it's not politically any longer. It is in many ways dependent on other Arab countries now. I mean, for better or for worse, Nasser had a vision. He had a vision of the role of Egypt in the Arab world, about leading the Arab world towards Arab unity, and so on and so forth. Egypt has not had a vision for a long time. Beginning, the last person in Egypt, last president in Egypt to have a vision for the country was President Anwar Sadat, who is the one who took the decision of first of going to Jerusalem, which means acknowledging, recognizing the Israeli government that no Arab country had recognized since 1948, and then to concluding the Camp David Accord peace agreement with Israel. Now, what it did is it made Egypt extremely popular with the United States. The United States started seeing Egypt as a real ally, as a real partner in the Middle East, after all these years of very difficult relations with Nasser, who was looking to Moscow more than to the United States. And so Egypt became very popular in the United States. It became an ally for the United States. It became a pariah in the rest of the Arab world. And in fact, for many years, there were very bad relationships between Egypt and the rest of the Arab world, which means that essentially Egypt was no longer a beacon. The Sadat's successor, Hosni Mubarak, was a man whose main interest was not to shake the boat. He was not a leader. He had no trace of charisma, to use he was certainly not anybody that the Arab world would look up to. So in terms of US interest now, Egypt is a much diminished entity from what it used to be. And from a realistic perspective, relations with Egypt are not as important as it used to be. Let me add one element, that Egypt is, of course, the country that harbors the Suez Canal, but the Suez Canal is also becoming less important because it's important in terms of trade. It's not a strategic asset any longer because wars in the Middle East have shown that nothing is easier than blocking the Suez Canal. So that essentially, as a strategic asset, it has limited value because it's so easy to block it. And if you remember, last winter, there was a crisis that it was not a military crisis, but there was a very large cargo ship that ran aground and ended up by blocking the Suez Canal for many, many days, with great losses to Egypt, but also great losses to international trade. So even the Suez Canal is no longer the asset that it used to be. So what about now? Let's look at Egypt from an idealistic point of view. And from an idealistic perspective, what are US interests? And they are the same as they are everywhere. To promote democracy, there is plenty of evidence that democratic countries don't go to war with each other. So that essentially, and that's one of the reasons behind the US interest in promoting democracy in addition to principles. So the democracy promotion, the protection of human rights. is another one. And in fact, the issue of human rights is central to US policy towards Egypt right now. And as part of human rights, of course, the issue of women's rights, that is also paramount in the relationship with Egypt. Now, this is good. It's good to say we should promote all these things. I do believe, I agree with Churchill that democracy, you know, is a terrible political system, except for all the others. Democracy, as we know, if we look at the political scene in the United States now, it's a very problematic political system, but it's still better than all the alternatives. So I do believe in the importance of democracy. I'm very skeptical about the US capacity to promote democracy in countries that are not democratic. And this is something that really needs to be kept in mind very clearly. Since the fall of the Soviet Union and all the socialist regime in Eastern Europe, the United States has pursued programs of democracy promotion. There is money in the USA budget for democracy promotion. It's much smaller amount than military aid and so on, but there are substantial amounts of money going to democracy promotion in many other countries. And these democracy promotion programs go into supporting elections, in trying to support the setting up of political parties, supporting clean elections, reforming the judiciary, promoting civil society organization. There is an entire democracy promotion industry that has grown up since during the 90s and afterwards, of international NGOs, organizations that specialize in democracy promotion, with money provided by the US government, but also with money provided by other European governments. Britain, Germany, and so on are all supporting democracy promotion to some extent, particularly Britain. So what are the results of this? And I would argue that the results are very modest. In other words, the United States can help a country that has already decided to embrace democracy, setting up the institution, setting up the, the mechanical processes that are needed to make democracy work. For example, the United States is very good at helping countries organize elections. Why? Because organizing elections is a technical thing. You know, and you have experts who know how many voting stations you need for how many people, etc. And what is the best way to setting this up? And what is the best way to go about voters registration and so on, and can provide very effective help in doing this. But that's based on the goodwill of the government. If the government is not interested in clean elections, we can set up all the technical processes we want, and nothing is going to come out of that. So has the United States ever been successful in promoting democracy? There are only two examples that people who believe in the US capacity to support the democracy mention, and they are Germany and Japan in the aftermath of World War II. Certainly, both countries became democratic. Japan more slowly. Japan for a long time was a de facto one-party system, right? A dominant party system. But they both moved in the direction of in the direction of democracy. Does the United States deserve credit for that? To some extent, but let's not forget that also the Germans and the Japanese deserve most of the praise for this transition, because it was the leaders in those two countries that embraced the idea that it was time to turn a page and to move their countries towards the democracy. So And in countries where the United States has not had a partner the way the United States had in Germany and Japan, the success has been very, very limited. The two recent examples that we have in front of us are that of Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan, you know, it's back in the hands of the Taliban. So that was certainly with all the money that US invested in democracy, in human rights, in promotion of women's rights, in standing up a military apparatus for the country. We spent billions of dollars, and we are back, and the country is back in the hands of Taliban. There is no way to look at it as a success. Same thing, somewhat less dramatically, is Iraq. Iraq has theoretically a democratic system in the sense it holds elections regularly, and yes, election results are respected more or less, and yet it's an extremely dysfunctional government. It's a government that has trouble getting anything done. Keep in mind that the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. It occupied it for 7 years, then it got out, then it went back in against ISIS, against the Islamist State. The United States, again, spent a lot of money there. And just to give you an idea of the dysfunctionality of that government, we are now, 18 years after the original occupation of Iraq, and Iraq still has not been able to restore electricity supply to the entire, reliable electricity supply to the entire population, despite the fact that it is a major oil producer and it's a major exporter of oil and gets a lot of money from oil revenue. In other words, we have not been able to stand up a government that could get things done. So there is a question, same for human rights. I don't know that any country has ever become, I mean, the question is always, should we impose sanctions in order to promote human rights? You know, we'll withhold military aid, that's the issue concerning Egypt right now, unless you make progress towards better protection of human rights. As far as I know, and I have done quite a lot of work on this, there is no country that has really become respectful of human rights because the United States threaten withhold foreign aid. From a moral point of view, it is very appealing to say, we are not going to play with you unless you behave better. You know, it's right, morally. The question is, does it have any impact? Or it's an empty moral victory where we can, you know, say, oh, how good we are promoting human rights without in fact having any impact on what's happening in the country. The same for women's rights. Essentially, women's rights, yeah, the United States can preach it, it can help set up organizations and so on. In the end, what really leads to the women to acquire their rights is their own efforts, which in turn are related to the level of education. So then essentially, probably promoting education for women is more effective than promoting women's rights in the abstract, because these are battles in the end that have to be fought inside the country. I'm not saying that there is anything wrong in promoting women's rights. There is nothing wrong in helping women. But the fact is that the effectiveness depends on what women in the individual countries do, both at the national level, at the level of government, but also at the level of individual fights within every family, because it's more promoting women's rights. It's more than just promoting better legislation. It's also women finding the courage to stand up for their own rights. So my impression is that, yes, these are important values, and I share I share those values. I'm very skeptical about our capacity to to really make them work. Okay, let me come back to the case of Egypt, since we are coming, towards the end of that this talk. I think essentially we have three options in our policy towards it. Let me backtrack a moment. The United States has provided, since the signing of the Camp David Agreement, a substantial amount of aid to Egypt. Some of that aid is economic aid. The United States has done something that nobody ever gives it credit for, that is the reconstructing of a large part of the sewage system in Cairo and Alexandria. It's not a sexy topic, the sewage system, but if you have lived the way I have in Cairo at a time where breakdown of the sewage systems were constant, and you always found yourself in front of a street flooded with sewage water. And, people like me live in the good parts of town where these incidents were more rare. There were sections of the town where people lived in sewage water all the time. Rebuilding the sewage system is a major accomplishment. The United States not only did not get enough credit for it, but did not even push to get much credit for it. Somehow you don't go and send high-level dignitaries to cut the ribbon on new sewer pipes. That's not the way it works. So some of the work, there has been a certain amount of economic aid, and the United States has done good things in terms of economic aid. I would argue it also has squandered a lot of aid on projects that in the end don't make much difference. I would argue sending Egyptian women, for example, to watch how elections are carried out in the United States, that I think really does not make any difference one way or another. They are not expensive programs, so the amount of wastage is limited, but it's not particularly important. So the most important part of aid is military aid. And the reason for the military aid is, one, that it was promised to Egypt as it was essentially part of the sweetener when Sadat signed the Camp David Agreement. You make peace with Israel and we'll help you modernize your military and so on and so forth. The United States, the US officials also claim that providing military aid to Egypt provide them with access to the military establishment. And in a country where the military plays a most important political role, this access is important. In theory, I agree. In practice, it does not work that way. For example, the military carried out this military that the United States has not only supplied with weapons, that has bought many of the officers here for training and so on for years and years and years. This military where the US prided itself in having access to high-ranking officers carried out a coup d'etat that the United States did not want in 2013. So, it's questionable whether or not this aid really works. But the point is that there is aid going to Egypt, and that and most of this aid is military. So the question that is in front of us is, should the United States limit this aid to Egypt, or should it carry out as normal? Essentially, we have three options now in our relationship toward Egypt. The first one is to continue business as usual, pretending that there is no particular problem. This is the point of view that's that's advocated by realists. Yes, Egypt is not as important as it used to be, but Egypt is still important. It's still a country of 100 million people. It's still, in many ways, the center of the Arab world. Yeah, it's declining, but it's still very important. Let's not rock the boat. It is important to maintain that relationship with Egypt. So let's close our eyes to the fact that Sisi is an autocrat. You know, this was the policy of the Trump administration. Trump called Sisi his favorite dictator. Well, we don't have to go. A realistic policy would not require the United States to go, the government to go as far as Trump did. We don't have to call Sisi our favorite dictator, but we can carry on with normal relations as if there was not a problem. The second alternative is to impose sanctions to punish, including the withholding of foreign aid, which there is a proposal now to do that for a certain amount of the military aid. To withhold part of the aid, nobody, as far as I know, nobody has, well, probably somebody has talked, but nobody in a relevant policy position has talked about withholding all foreign aid, interrupting all foreign aid to Egypt. Withholding part of the foreign aid, unless Egypt meets certain conditions in terms of, particularly in terms of human rights. In other words, it's a way to promote sanctions. Withholding aid is only one aspect of sanction. You could do much further if you start, you know, punishing the country by interrupting trade, making it difficult, you know, the payment system and the banking system and so on. That is also keeping high Egyptian officials from coming here, the way we have been doing with other countries, particularly, for example, with Iran in recent years. The only problem with that, in my opinion, and from the work that I have done on that issue, is that sanctions don't really work. I mean, we delude ourselves. Sanctions are many ways the weapon of choice for the United States, because it's relatively easy to impose sanctions on a country, to withhold aid and so on. The big question is, does it work? And there is very little evidence, according to work, the way I read the evidence, that shows that sanctions really work. This is an issue that I have to admit where there is disagreement, that not everybody agrees with me. Let me give you an example. Americans believe, many Americans believe, including government officials, that the imposition of sanctions in South Africa in the 80s was a major factor in leading to the release of Nelson Mandela from jail, and then from the South African transition from apartheid to democracy. I don't think it's true. The work that I have done suggests that the South African government, the apartheid government, had reached the conclusion that it was not, that apartheid was not working, that apartheid had failed, and they had to introduce reforms, and started talking to Nelson Mandela in prison even before the United States imposed the sanctions. Did the sanctions help? Probably they added another element to, you know, an incentive to pursue a policy that the government had already started following. If you want any proof that sanctions do not work, you look at Iran. Iran has been under US sanctions for many years. There have, I don't want to go into Iranian politics and policies because they take us too far, but we have repeatedly imposed the sanctions. the Trump administration imposed additional sanctions on Iran, and there is absolutely no sign that Iran is inclined to change its policy. So I think and one argument that then is, yes, we can impose sanctions, yes, we can withhold foreign aid, but that's not necessarily a useful policy. Is it worth pursuing it? Nevertheless, in other words, on principle, maybe it does not bring about results, but this is the right thing to do, and we should do the right thing, and therefore withhold foreign aid and impose sanctions. The danger of that is that sanctions have a cost for the countries on which they are imposed, not just to the leadership, but also to certain kind of sanctions, certain kind of withdrawal of foreign aid on the general population. And the general population are, after all, the people that we should be trying to help. So that, for example, sanctions tend to impoverish people in a country without unnecessarily hurting the leadership, because somehow the leadership, the economy suffers, but the leadership always finds a way of skimming off the, what there is to be skimmed off. So I am not convinced that the withholding foreign aid and imposing sanctions really serve any practical purpose. Probably withholding military aid, it's less costly to the population than withholding economic aid, but still I have a real doubt about the effectiveness. The third alternative is not to go on in business as usual, but maintain correct but colder relationship with Egypt. In other words, yes, we don't have to break off diplomatic relations. Yes, we have to continue talking to Egypt. I think it's never a good idea to stop talking to anybody. But we do not have to keep on talking about Egypt as a strategic ally of the United States. And I think it's worth while making clear that we pick our friends. And if you want to be a strategic ally of the United States, then you have to rethink the way you run your government and so on. All in all, I would be in favor of that third alternative. I will stop here in this presentation and open up to Q&A. And I hope that we can come, there can be some discussion about the three alternatives that we have. I thank you very much for your attention.
Bravo, Marina. It's a great pleasure to listen to you and go through that history, which at my age, I've lived through, from the attack on the Suez Canal and the fall and Eisenhower stepping in and all those good things going on till the present day. And your talk has certainly got us a number of questions from the audience out there. And I don't know where to begin, because they touch different aspects of it, but one I think you can answer fairly readily, and that is, has President Al-Sisi's regime effectively crushed the Islamic Brotherhood as a political influence in the country?
That's a very interesting question. And the only honest answer that I can give you is, I don't know. Because certainly, superficially, yes, Muslim brothers are either underground or they are in exile. A lot of the leadership left the country. A lot was imprisoned right after the coup d'etat of July 2013 and so on. And the rest, God only knows where they are at this point. They are probably still in Egypt, but not in. I have not been able to, in the days before COVID, I traveled a lot to Egypt, and I have not been able to talk to any Muslim brother leader there since 2014. And the last time, about a year after the coup d'etat, and the last time I managed to talk to somebody, it was one of those cloak and dagger exercises where you meet in at a certain street corner who somebody to lead you somewhere else and so on. And finally, we got to talk to this person who was very much in hiding. So, but the problem is in answering the question that we don't know what still exists underground. And the Muslim Brotherhood in all countries, or these organizations that are ideologically related to the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, have a very good track record of surviving in clandestinity. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood survived years of repression under Nasser. Al-Sisi is not the first person to try and crush the Muslim Brotherhood. And, it arrested leaders, it executed leaders, it exiled leaders. And it popped up again as soon as Sadat opened up the door to them, because Sadat wanted to reduce the influence of the Nasserists in order to solidify his position. So the big question that I really don't know how to answer is, let me give you another example before today. In Tunisia, the government in the 90s did try to crush Ennahda, which is another Islamist political party. Essentially, it's the Tunisian Muslim Brotherhood, if you want. It's not, well, it's complicated, but let's call it the Tunisian Muslim Brotherhood. 2011, as soon as the repression ceased, it popped up again and went on to win the election overwhelmingly. So that, these organizations have a good track record of surviving underground because they are highly organized. They are organized. If one can talk about an Islamic organization being Leninist, yes, they are. They are in terms of how you organize, about how you structure the organization, how you have separate cells and so on. And they're very well set up to survive. Can it, we certainly don't see it now. Could it pop up again as a major influence? I don't think we can totally eliminate this, but at the same time, you cannot be sure.
Thank you
Sure.
for that. This is a question that's probably closer to this American side of your choices, because the person is asking how much does the military industrial complex in the United States rule U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the case of Egypt, where we saw that 99% almost of the aid is military. And is that something we should take into account?
There is no doubt that the military would like to keep its relationship with the Egyptian, the US military would like to keep its relationship with the Egyptian military. They do value those contacts. I don't think they are the ones who are making the policy. And that's why there is a proposal to reduce the aid. So I don't think the military industrial complex has veto power over that decision.
I would like to agree with you, but we'll see. Another question again. It's amazing how off different directions your talk has got questions from the audience. And this one, is Hank Berger saying, has the warm peace between Israel and the United Arab Emirates affected the cold peace between Egypt and Israel? What have those relationships which have opened up in the Middle East with Israel done in effect to Egypt?
Yeah, the Abraham Accord that was signed first by the United Arab Emirates with Israel, and then was embraced by Bahrain, eventually by the Sudan and Morocco. There are 4 countries now that have. Egypt has, well, Egypt did not join it officially because it already had peace with Israel. As the person who asked the question knows, the peace between Egypt and Israel has always been very cold. There has been more than anything else, from what I can tell, very strong military cooperation between the Egyptian military and the Israeli military over two issues. One is the security in the Sinai, and second, the control of the border between Gaza and Egypt. There has always been cooperation there and so on. But certainly relations have been very, very cold. I have not seen anything now that suggests that relations have become much warmer. For example, in the case of the United Arab Emirates, I was listening the other day to the ambassador here talk about, tourism in the number of Israeli tourists going to the United Arab Emirates has skyrocketed. I mean, has gone from zero to being very high. I have not seen similar figures concerning Egypt. I think there is still a lot of mutual suspicion between those two countries. Will it help in the long run? Probably, to some extent, but I don't see, keep in mind that for the time being, there are 4 countries that have embraced this change in the relationship with Israel. So I don't see a warmer peace right now between Egypt and
Israel. I don't know if you know some numbers, but I was just curious about how the U.S. 1.43 billion for the next year compares with economic aid from the other countries in that region. For example, in the olden days, Russia put a lot of money into Egypt, but today, I imagine most of the money must come from the Middle East.
Yeah, most of the money. Russia is not, significant in terms of economic aid right now. Military aid, a little bit. They are trying to introduce new weapon systems, and Egypt plays the game the way Turkey does and so on. It's a way of it's an old game that countries play. You don't want to give me this, well, I'll get it from them. But it's not a major concern at this point. It might become, but it's not a major concern at this point. Most of the aid, and I cannot cite figures because they're not easy to get, comes from the countries that have really made important contributions to Egyptian coffers are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. That particularly in the time after, let's see, in 2012, the Egyptian, after the 2011 uprising, and in the period of when the Muslim Brotherhood controlled the government in Egypt, the Egyptian economy was on its knees. And right after the coup d'etat, and probably it had been promised before the coup d'etat, the Saudi Arabia and Egypt added billions of dollars to the dwindling foreign currency reserves of Egypt to allow it to meet, its payment, its requirements. Now, I don't know. I've never really followed this up closely. I've never seen figures about how much of this money was loans that then were repaid. We put our money in your foreign reserve, but it's still our money, and we get it back when things stabilize. How much became foreign aid? I really don't have figures, but certainly the competitions come from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which means that from the point of view of the United States, it's benign competition. It's benign aid. In fact, that helps the United States bolster the same regime that they would like to stay in power. Because after all, the United States, Even people who don't much like Al-Sisi don't see an alternative at this point.
Yes. Looking at U.S. foreign policy, one of the questions that's being asked is, are there other countries that you mentioned earlier, Germany and I guess United Kingdom, as being important in terms of trying to sell democracy? Are there other countries like that who are trying to influence Egypt to go back to some form of democracy rather than carry on the way it has with the military?
I don't think
there
there
anyone
are
else out there, in other words?
I don't think there are many active programs of democracy promotion in Egypt right now, including on the part of the United States, because Egypt has shut down all international NGOs that were trying to promote a democracy, including by arresting, there are these two major organizations in the United States that are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which in turn is funded by the State Department, and they are the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute. Both of them had offices in Egypt, and they have been closed, those offices. And in fact, there are very significant restrictions at this point on international and domestic NGOs operating in Egypt in terms of accepting money from overseas, that unless it's sanctioned by the government, people who receive that aid risk arrest. And in fact, there have been cases of arrest among the members of the International Republican Institute in Egypt, the Egyptian staff, not the foreign staff. But so there are, in other words, even organizations that normally do that find it difficult to operate in Egypt now. Some of the German foundations, but they mostly work on labor rights rather than directly on democracy promotion. So I think there is very little in terms of active democracy promotion.
Going on. A book that I'm reading now is by a woman by the name of Amy Chow, and she's writing about political tribes. And for example, she says that during the Vietnam War, what America didn't realize was the war, from the Vietnamese perspective, was to get rid of the Chinese influence in Vietnam. At that time, the Chinese owned something like 90% of the wealth in Vietnam. And so the war was really a war of liberation, as they saw it, against the influence of the Chinese. And in fact, once the war stopped, the Vietnamese did effectively diminish the role of the Chinese. And translating that into Egypt, I wonder, are there tribal influences in Egypt that Amy Chow, who hasn't studied Egypt, would see from her perspective? And again, the other example she talks about is, of course, Afghanistan, where Americans didn't understand the relationship between the Sunni and the Shia regimes, and how they misjudged the length of the Sunni regime and how it was put into second-class citizenship by the Americans. So I don't know if Egypt would be part of this belief of hers in terms of tribal instinct.
But first, a general statement. I agree that the United States often intervenes in these countries around the world, understanding very little of the situation. We went into Egypt without really understanding the Sunni-Shia difference, and then we found ourselves in hot water as a result of it. I'm not sure that Amy Chow is really true about that the main reason for the war was getting rid of the Chinese influence. I'm not an expert on that area, but I don't know. if that is the case. Now, and certainly in Afghanistan, we never understood the dynamic, not only of the major ethnic groups, but the clans, the tribes. And I mean, Afghanistan was totally beyond our capacity to even begin to understand. I think Egypt is not quite the tribal, in the sense that Egypt is a very homogeneous country. There is a Coptic, that is a Christian minority in Egypt, which the official figure is that they are around 7% of the population. They're probably more around 15% of the population. These are all estimates. And but they are too small to really play an important role. I mean, there are, clashes between Christians and Muslims, particularly in Upper Egypt, where most of the Christians are located, but it's not, I don't think it's a very important part of the dynamic. So I find it difficult to see this influence of specific groups, whether you want to call them tribes and so on, as major part of the political dynamics. For example, there are practically no Shias in Egypt. I mean, there are some, but there are very few Shias in Egypt, so they're even less of a political factor than Christians are.
Don?
Yes, go ahead, Mal.
I wondered if we could ask Professor Ottaway.
Click your video on so we
You want
see.
the video too? Oh,
Yeah,
nice.
we got to
Yeah,
see.
it's nice to see people.
Oh, okay. If I get my
Where
mouse
is
to
he?
point at the, when I can get to my mouse to point at the right thing, you got it. I was wondering if we could ask Professor Ottaway to pivot slightly from the focus on America trying to affect the democracy and other structural things within the country, particularly Egypt, to a question of whether American policy could affect Egypt and other countries in that region in terms of their focus on and participation in promoting the stability and the safety and the prosperity of their region itself. We've in addition to the billions that you talked about, Don, of our investing in Egypt, we've invested trillions of dollars and thousands of lives and all kinds of things in the name of democracy. But every time we want to pivot ourselves, let's say to Asia, we are constantly pulled back by some local or regional problem. Professor Ottaway, is there any hope of a regional compact, a regional something or other, of which Egypt is a part, maybe not a major part, that will make a difference in that region of the world?
That's a very good question. The question, we don't know. Egypt is pulling closer, has been pulling closer to the United Arab Emirates, to Saudi Arabia, although it's not recognized as a peer in many ways, because it's difficult to receive large, to have countries bail out your economy and then to be considered a major player, a major independent player yourself. The question is, the real underlying question is what would promote the stability in that area? Is that what we are seeing emerging essentially? It's an alignment of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt against Turkey and Qatar. Or what would be promote is promoting good relationship with Iran, which essentially is, unless those countries, all the countries of the region, manage to incorporate Iran in their, some sort of security compound, there is not going to be stability in the area. And I think what I see happening right now, it's more Egypt participating with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates on one side of that divide, rather than being a factor of reconciliation and therefore of stability.
The question that's come up is, could you tell us a little bit about the role of women in Egypt?
Well, it's an interesting question because probably in terms of the laws, Egypt is ahead of many Arab countries. Not the other North African countries. Tunisia probably has the best. Tunisia and Morocco have the best legislation in terms of. But for example, Egypt is way ahead of the Gulf countries. And I'm not quite sure where Iraq stands on this. But on the other hand, there is a lot of harassment against. I mean, women have the right to divorce. It's difficult to go out in the streets without getting harassed. I lived in Egypt for 4 years when I was considerably younger. And I know if I went out by myself, I got a lot of harassment. If I went out with my children, who are relatively small, I was left alone. Mothers are respected, women are not. So essentially, I needed a 6-year-old as my protection when I went out. So it's a very mixed picture of women. There have been horrendous cases of, for example, in the demonstrations, in Tahrir Square during 2011, of really very heavy-handed harassment towards women, including by the police, which was very important when arrested some of the women for obstructing the peace and so on. They were trying to, they had virginity tests on some of them, which to me was, I mean, it's not only the horror of that, but what does it mean that a woman can be raped as if she's not a virgin any longer? In other words, are all married women by definition free, sort of subject to, is it permissible to rape a married woman because in any case she is not a virgin? I mean, there is still a mentality in the society which very much belies relatively progressive legislation that has been adopted.
Marina Ottaway, you have exceeded our expectations with your knowledge and your ability to lead us logically through many arguments, starting with your going back to 2 different routes to the realism and the whatever, the love approach to foreign policy, and brought us up to date on the government there now in Egypt. And I want to thank you for that. I wish we had some private time other than this formal time, because I'm intrigued by your history of being in South Africa and Zambia and Ethiopia, all these countries. That
I give you the short answer. I am married to a guy who's a foreign correspondent for the Washington Post.
I see.
That explains this nomadic life.
Life. Yes. Anyway, thank you for being who you are and bringing us your knowledge and your interest in life. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
So Mal's going to talk to us now to second my motion of thanks and lead us on into the future.
Not only do I want to second your thanks, I want to broaden your thanks beyond Professor Ottaway to Diane Shields, who moderated this program and secured the program, to Joan Kuhn of the library and Carrie Krams and others who helped behind the scenes to make all of this happen, and especially all of you who participate with us regularly in these discussions. Thanks an awful lot. Let me say again what I did in the beginning, that in 2 weeks, on the 12th of October, we will be talking about the Philippines. Remember, the 12th is a Tuesday following Columbus Day. Until we meet again, please stay safe, please stay healthy. We're looking forward to continuing the discussion.